There we go. We will be recording today's program and posting it up on our website blog page by early next week. And other than that, I think we're all set to get ready and go here. So Jason, without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you to Tech Alpharetta for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I want to show a few slides as I get into the conversation, but this is going to be more of a just kind of an open dialogue and some thoughts around UX and how we apply UX in different business settings. So OneSpring was founded in 2005. So even before that, I was doing user experience work and business analysis work. So OneSpring's been doing it for a very long time. And we've seen different ways in which UX gets applied within an organization. So my hope today is to share some insights that I've gained over the years around where UX sits. And it's funny because a lot of times when I talk to people about user experience, especially if they're not in that space, they typically think of making a screen look better or beautifying some kind of interface. And UX goes so much deeper than that. And I hope today that I can shed some light on how deep it does go and where it could be applied in different settings and where it adds value throughout the organization. That's the topic of this discussion here. So before I go too much further, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to share my screen here. I want to talk about the differences between UX and UI. I think it's important to distinguish the two because I mentioned a minute ago, beautifying a screen, right? So, or help me redo a website, but there's so many facets to UX where it could be applied internal to an organization. So I think it's important to look at the difference between UX and UI, and then we're going to talk about CX as well. And I want to put all of those into context so you have a good understanding of where CX falls, where does UX get applied, how does this overlap, for example. So here's some simple capabilities just to think about. When you think about UX, you're looking at things like interactions that a user goes through, say a mobile device or on their computer. How do they actually interact with the interface? Things like wireframing and prototyping. At OneSpring, we do a ton of prototyping of just concepts and software interfaces and mobile devices. Information architecture, how do you organize the information on the application? What is the content strategy that's in play for the application? And then user research is a huge animal by itself. So research can go very deep into many different areas, from contextual inquiry all the way through focus groups, for example. So there's a lot of areas within user research that kind of falls under the UX umbrella. If you go over to the UI side, it's more visual, right? It's visual design. It's what does the color palette look like? Maybe it's logos and graphical design, it's screen layout and so forth. So usually what I do at OneSpring is when I'm interviewing somebody, I actually have a sliding scale between UX and UI, and I'll ask candidates, where do you fit on the scale? Are you more on the UX side or are you more on the UI side? And that kind of tells me where they would fit and if there's a need we have that they could fulfill. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail here on what it is and how it works. Let me show you this screen real quick. So just to further elaborate on the differences in how they overlap. So I'm bringing in CX now, customer experience. You can see UX fits within that CX world. So I'm going to give you some examples as we go through this conversation, real world examples on how to think about this. So CX is really the kind of emotional state of a user or customer. So it's the interactions they're having with the brand, the interactions they're having with the customer. And a lot of you have probably heard of things like a skill or tool like journey mapping, for example. And journey mapping is really looking at the interactions in a particular scenario of a user interacting with the brand. So they may go to the site, they may walk into your retail location, they're interacting, they may call. So there's different journey and touch points that a user has with your brand or your organization. CX is looking at that journey and trying to decipher where they can add more value, where are the pain points. They're really looking at kind of the analytics behind it, as well as the kind of human component, the ethnography behind it as well. Once you get into UX, you're getting into, and I pointed to this a minute ago, the information architecture, you're getting into the research side, prototyping, and then UI as well. So usually the skill sets we'll look for will be kind of a blend between research, UX, and UI. And if somebody has all of those skill sets, that's great. But typically they're distinguished between one another. So this just gives you a good visual of kind of how things overlap. So, one thing I want to talk about is that UX really goes deep. So I don't want everybody to think about UX in the context of just a web interface or mobile. A lot of the projects we've worked on are internal to an organization, like an HR system or a case management system. We actually just worked on a compliance management system with a large automotive company. So totally behind the scenes, interactions with a particular agency within the federal government to share information to make sure they're compliant. So it's really anything where a human needs to interact with an interface or a computer and they have to do something, that's where UX is going to fall. So the web side of it is a very small percentage of a lot of the work we do. We usually are getting brought in for more behind the scenes type of systems, right, that are being modernized. So it does run deep, but a few things that to think about around UX is the product innovation side, which I'm going to get a little bit more into. Optimizing processes. I mean, user experience is all about how do you smooth out a process, how do you optimize the interactions users having with a particular application or whatnot. So there's business processes, there's the information architecture I mentioned, and then ultimately you're trying to get to a happy customer, right? Trying to get to that state where you're improving the experience for the end consumer or the employee that's working for your company and so forth. It's all about optimizing that experience. So these are some stats. These stats are a little bit old, and but I think they're still relevant, and you may agree with some of these. One of the ones I wanted to point to is the 30% of project costs are rework. About 50% of the projects we get within OneSpring are rework type projects. So I'll give you an example, and this is a UX-based project. It was an IoT dashboard for a large manufacturer of industrial assets. So think bulldozers and things like that. IoT dashboard, they ended up engineering it without any user experience help. The developers ended up just building it, putting it out there. They got a ton of pushback from their customers because of the usability was an issue. So I want you to think about the cost of that kind of scenario. And you've probably been through this before, where you produce something quickly, you get it out the door, and then you start getting feedback, and there's pushback on what you've designed or how you've designed it, right? And then you start reworking it. It's a big, costly area. It's a lot of the work we get is we designed it. Can you redesign it because it's not working for our users? There's a high cost to doing that. So that's a lot of the work we actually get is help us out. So what I'm here to do is to try to talk about and educate around what is the value of doing it right and applying UX very early in the life cycle before you get to development. And I think companies are starting to catch on to this more, but there's still a ways to go. And hopefully I'll show you some of those examples and you'll kind of see where it fits. So I'm going to step back for a second and talk about CX a little bit more. I talked about the emotional journey mapping. This report here, I don't know, some of you may have heard of this. It's called the CX Index. It's put out by Forrester's every year. I wanted to show this because it shows some of the things they look for in their scoring models. So they look for effectiveness, ease of use, kind of the emotional state, that's kind of the journey mapping piece, and then retention, enrichment, and advocacy. So a lot of these things overlap with UX. So yes, in the CX world, they're identifying what is the effectiveness, how do we measure effectiveness? How do we measure the ease of use, the emotional state, the pain points that a user's having? So there's different tools around CX to do this. There's different analytics techniques to figure out a scoring model around how an organization's doing around a particular set of scenarios or interactions that a customer is having with the brand. This is important. I wanted to show this because in the UX world, it's kind of the same thing. You're trying to make it easy to use. You're trying to improve the emotional state of a user. So that's where the overlap comes in. But it's important to note that UX, in my mind, is more of the tactical piece of the equation. So you have somebody in CX, let's say they do a journey map and they figure out a particular pain point. That pain point should make its way down to a UX practitioner that can look at it, maybe do some more research on it, and then potentially prototype a solution that they can go do usability testing on to figure out, does it solve the pain point that you've identified? If it does, how do we get it into our production schedule so we can actually release a fix or a new application to help alleviate the pain? So there's a lot of CX UX overlap, if you will. And in fact, a lot of our UX practitioners, they'll do journey mapping, they know how to do it, they'll go over into the CX world and help in those areas early in the life cycle. I want to show this. This is an actual page from the CX index. And I'm going to use this in the context of some of the discussion here. So this one's a little old, it's 2017. I don't have the latest and greatest, but back in 2017, Lexus was considered #1 in their CX score. Mercedes second. So if you have any of these vehicles, you probably have a feeling if you agree or disagree, right? So, but I showed you the measures, what they're looking for and how they have their own analytics and how they pick a winner, I guess. But if you look at the CX index itself, it has all the major industries in it, even has government in it as well. So Lexus is #1. So let's, we'll kind of keep moving here. And I want to break down the kind of the value points and how I'm framing this discussion. And this is important because I want to identify where UX falls within each of these things. So any company out there has to come up with ideas and business cases to do work. And in a lot of our projects, executives may contact us and say, we know we want to modernize something. We want to be forward leaning. We want to think 10 years out, and we don't know exactly how to get everybody aligned, right, with the direction we want to head. Well, one thing is you could do in kind of the idea or business case stage is a discovery phase. And I'm going to take you through an example of what that looks like. The other value area is product management. So you've gone through this discovery phase and you've gained alignment. You figured out the direction of a project. Everybody's in agreement with what needs to happen moving forward. Maybe you've gone to the epic level if you're using Agile, and now you're getting into product management. And you want to actually produce the software or enhance the software. And then of course at the end, customer value, which I talked a little bit about the measurements of those values. So all of this is very cyclical. So you come up with an idea, you produce that idea, you push it out, and now your customers are interacting, right, with the product that you pushed out there. So now think about the CX piece of this. Now you have this journey of somebody using an application or having an experience with your brand. What kind of experience are they having? So a lot of these measurements, it's important to note that they happen after the fact. Something's been produced and pushed out to market. You're getting feedback. And they also happen when it's a blue sky idea and you're trying to figure out what the value points are on that idea upfront and early. And if you have to do rework, you're kind of going through the cycle again, right? So you pushed it out, there's issues, you're redoing it. What does it look like now? Did we resolve the pain points? So that's why I have the arrows kind of going left to right. But I'm kind of grouping UX in this way so we can talk about, given the limited time we have, around what does a discovery phase look like? If I have an idea, how do I get everybody aligned? And then once you get into product management, what are some thought processes around that and maybe some methodologies around that? And then end customer value, looking at the analytics and so forth. I won't go too much in the analytics side. I'll stick mostly with the discovery and software phase. So I want to try to use the Lexus example. I showed the CX scoring. Lexus is number one. So let's think about the journey for a Lexus. Let's say you're considering buying a Lexus. Probably the first experience you have is you've seen it on a car on the road that you like, right? You've seen it, you had some feeling about it, and you said, I'm going to go investigate this more because I need a new car. So what do? You go to the website, right? So you have an interaction with the website. What does that experience look like? Do you get the information that you were looking for? Does it push you into the next action stage, which is go to the dealership, right? So they're analyzing that. Of course, all companies should be looking at, how do I convert them to the store or convert them into a purchasing customer? So now you go into the dealership, in this case for Lexus. What is the experience there? This is all CX. What is the experience there? But now where we would transition potentially to more of a UX type project would be, let's say they come up with an idea of, hey, we want to have a kiosk. Right when they walk in, there's a self-service kiosk right at the front. They can search, the cars they have at the dealership at that given moment. They can do different things, different actions and so forth with this kiosk. Let's just assume they have that, or they want to have that. It's an idea. Here's an example of the discovery phase, a typical one we would go through. So you have this idea or project kind of in the beginning. You're going through some planning, which of course is, what are we doing? What's the timetable look like? You're prioritizing your activities. You're kicking off the project. And this one was, as an example, over 4 weeks. The main thing I want to point to here is the design thinking kind of loop. So over a 4-week period, we may end up doing a couple of design thinking type workshops. Now, in this example with the kiosk, it's critical to try to figure out who needs to be there, who you need to talk to in advance. If you're blending in user research, well, you want to go talk to consumers. So we want to go out and talk to somebody that just went through the experience of identifying what car they want, going to the dealership, driving it, and actually going through that process to try to figure out how helpful would it be to them when they went into the dealership to have a kiosk. And if we determine through this discovery phase in the research that it's not a great idea, that most people are going to just walk right past that kiosk and go right to the front desk and want to talk to a salesperson, then we have to decide during this discovery phase, is it worth pursuing, right? So you're kind of getting into the business case area, but the reason UX is so important here is because you're doing the research. And usually what we end up doing is we may do surveys where we send out a survey to potentially thousands of people that just bought a Lexus to try to distill down, is this a valuable idea or not? What was their experience like, and could we improve it? It may be contextual inquiry. We're actually talking directly with individuals that maybe are thinking about buying a Lexus or have bought, and kind of get a blend of experiences. It could be focus groups, right? There's a lot of that type of research that can happen in the beginning, given your time and budget, to try to distill down the actual data around that process to see if the idea of a kiosk is worth pursuing or not pursuing. So let me show you this real quick. So these are some of the skill sets that I just talked about. The current state is, what do you have right now? So maybe they don't have a kiosk. Okay, you don't have anything right now. What you have is somebody walking in and talking to somebody directly. Okay, that would probably be pretty easy to define. I talked about user research. You may look at personas, and some of this crosses into marketing as well, because marketing may have personas. They may have some journey maps already. And one of the first questions we'll ask early is, do you have personas? Do you have journey maps? What information do you have about the customers going into the dealership? And if they have nothing, which in this case, Toyota does have a lot of that information, but if they have nothing, we would propose looking at personas, trying to figure out the day in the life of a particular type of buyer. Who are their buyers? And that's where the marketing side crosses in, because they would have a lot of that information. Design thinking, you've probably heard of that. That's, for us, is more of it's a workshop, basically, where you're getting together with users. And a lot of times we'll be prototyping concepts in real time with customers. And we'll bring in process modeling, we'll bring in potential screen design mock-ups, and we can start rapidly prototyping some ideas with them to start getting a feel of that. One thing that's not really listed here is usability testing. You can, as part of a discovery phase, do usability testing. So for those of you that don't know what that is, you're basically prototyping a concept, let's say the kiosk interface, and it's codeless. We may take that prototype into the field with some of the users we talked to in the beginning that we were doing the research on, and let them click through the prototype and start doing moderated and unmoderated testing with them to get a better idea of their experience and how they interact with it to improve the user experience overall of the application. And again, this is all pre-development, really trying to get a feel of, is this going to work? And if we decide we are going to move forward with this kiosk, then let's really fine tune and optimize the process, right? And we're optimizing the experience and trying to improve that. So here's a typical timetable for a discovery schedule. And typically they're, let's say 3 to 4 weeks, but I won't go through all of these, but it will give you a good idea. The planning in week 1, you're looking at the current state in week 1, you're starting the user research. A lot of cases we'll go to the client and say, can you give us the names of the individuals that have bought from your organization? So give us some customers. And if they don't have that, or they don't want to share it, some cases they don't, then we'll go recruit. And on the research side, the recruiting can take time. So that's when the schedules get blown out. We have to go find people to interview and so forth. So in most cases, we highly encourage clients to give us information, give us a list of users we can reach out to. And if they do that, it moves pretty quickly. Week 2, personas, we may do a design thinking workshop with executives to talk about the future state based on the research that we did. We'll get into things like user stories in week 3, maybe do another design thinking workshop to fine tune kind of the learnings. Start prioritizing, maybe create hill statements, statements of intent, maybe high level features or epics, depending on what the client wants to do, we'll kind of adapt. And then you may get into wireframing. If they say, we're definitely going to move forward with this kiosk, let's start mapping out a wireframing. We can get right into wireframing. And that's where, what I talked about in the beginning, kind of the UX UI side comes into play, because the UX practitioner would be able to start prototyping some designs. They may need to lean on a UI designer to help make them look really good. So, and then you get to the end and you have this 4-week fast-moving discovery phase that you did research in, you looked at the personas that exist, you did some workshops with the executive team and potentially some users or customers. You've prioritized what you need to do going into a production phase, right? You haven't built it yet, you're not there, all in 4 weeks or 3 weeks. So it's a very fast-moving piece to get everybody aligned. So that's the discovery phase, which ties UX into that beginning kind of value stage, if you will, of a life cycle. Some people refer to this as like a sprint 0 or level 0. It could even be before that, like we're not there yet. We still just want to go do research before we even get into discussing that. There are different terms. There's no one exact way. We found that discovery schedules or discovery phases are really popular, and they really help clients kind of get out what they want to do and want to achieve. Okay, I know you probably have questions, so I'll get to the end and then I'll open it up for everybody. So let's talk about product management. So product management obviously is a very complicated area, and you can see I have idea level 0 there in the beginning. So let's just assume we did a discovery phase and they said, we're going to move forward with this kiosk and we're going to build this out, right? So you're kind of moving down the life cycle. Now, this view is a little bit waterfall-ish, if you will. I mean, it has scope, define, develop, test, launch, but for simplicity's sake, I think it's good to have it this way just to see overall what it looks like. Now, we've been talking about this graph and for years, basically, and we used to call it the clarity curve. And basically what it is the level of understanding your users have and your subject matter experts have and the business has of what you're producing over the life cycle of product development. So let's say this product phase for the kiosk was going to be 6 months, to complete. Well, we don't want to go towards the end, once we get towards the end development and testing and start seeing kind of what's being pushed out there. That's too late. So when that happens, the level of clarity and understanding increases dramatically once people start seeing what's being produced. I mentioned rework a little while ago, and this is where a lot of the rework comes in. In that case of the IoT example I gave, where they just built it and pushed it out to market and got a lot of pushback, they followed this, they made this mistake, basically. The engineers produced it. They didn't do really a discovery phase on it. They push it out. Well, now clients start seeing it, start interacting with it, and guess what? Their level of understanding of what they're going to get isn't exactly what they thought they were going to get. So you have this level of understanding increase, and it creates this kind of gap, if you will. And the gap, I just call it a value gap. It's how do you shift the level of understanding to the very beginning of the life cycle? That's the goal. So UX practitioners harp on this stuff, right? And that's where design thinking came from. Design sprints you may have heard of. So there's a lot of different terms out there, but Agile, of course, is everywhere. So in Agile, you may have a design sprint, and this is something we push consistently, where if you're familiar with Agile, and I'm sorry if I'm going off course here with this, but if you do a design sprint, you may have staggered sprints. So you may have a 2-week design sprint where we're going to prototype the designs and create the user stories with UX practitioners, product owners, and other SMEs. And then you're going to have a development sprint. So you may have a 2-week design, 2-week development, 2-week design, 2-week development, staggered sprints. And so design sprint is popular. It's kind of 50-50. A lot of companies will just integrate UX right into the development sprint. You have a UX practitioner on the team. So there's a couple ways to do this, integrated versus staggered. But my point with this graph is that you're trying to shift. How do you shift the level of understanding to the beginning to reduce the rework on the back end and to improve the odds that you're going to have better retention, better ease of use, right? All that stuff I pointed back to in the CX index. How do you ensure that? Well, if we can prototype in the beginning, and I showed that in the discovery phase, like as we started to get in discovery, we started prototyping concepts. We could test drive those concepts, as I mentioned, early in the life cycle prior to getting into the sprints. So if we can do that and get a better understanding, we can help groom the backlog for the development team, then we're closing that gap, improving the value overall, reducing the risk on the back end. So when it does get launched, there's no big surprises. So this is where a lot of organizations struggle with this, because what happens, and you may agree or disagree, but what I've seen with a lot of companies is they rush to the technology too fast. Project starts, what platform are we going to use to do this? They end up maybe buying a platform or not, and they just rush in with the development team and they start sprints right away. We're going to do development sprint, we're going to start defining user stories. Well, sometimes it's going to work out. Sometimes, especially if it's high-end design, a lot of user interfaces, in my experience, it doesn't work too well because you didn't put the due diligence and the effort into the design piece. You're kind of looking at it as an afterthought and rushing to the development piece. Now, from a budgetary perspective and political perspective, I get it may be beneficial because you're showing progress quicker, but in the long run, and I talked about that rework, you're probably going to have rework down the road. And you're probably going to have to redo something, and it's going to be more costly. So again, how do we reduce that? And that's where I feel it's critical to an organization, is to try to figure out how to integrate UX and design in a more meaningful way earlier. Those are two examples and thoughts that I wanted to share with the group, just to hopefully shed light on it, get you thinking about, well, how do I shift? The discovery is a very unique 3-week, 4-week, very defined. Whereas this, once you get into product management, you're actually producing software is more complicated. And I mentioned the agile staggered and the integrated models. There's how do you look at that holistically? Where does CX tie in? There's a lot of facets to it. Karen, how am I doing on time? I have a little bit more. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
It helps if I unmute. 12:31.
Okay. Okay, I want to make sure I have enough time for questions. So I'm going to wrap up my conversation or dialogue here with this. Everything I talked about kind of falls under this human-centered design umbrella. Some of you may have heard of HCD. Some of you maybe not, but I'll explain it briefly. It's really a methodology that we follow and a lot of practitioners follow. Sometimes it's called user-centered design. We see it a lot in RFPs. We see it talked about a lot, but it's basically this. It is a simple methodology. The key thing here is that the empathy side. I think the empathize is one of those terms that may be looked at as a little soft and not technical, but what you're trying to do, if you're doing good CX and good UX, you have to get in the minds of the consumer and the user. So what you try to do is you remove your bias from it. And I can't tell you how many times I've been on projects where there's bias. There's always bias, right? People think they know what the user wants, but you have to be in their seat, basically, the user's seat, to see how do they actually interact. Even the environment. Like we've done usability testing where on a mobile device, app where, people are doing the unmoderated testing and they're laying in bed or they're walking down the street with their dog or they're in the car doing it, right? And you see all these different environments in which they're using it. So if they are walking their dog or they're doing something, then just think about the dexterity side of it. What does the actual interaction need to be based on how most people are using this? Physically, how do they move their thumbs and what's the optimal way to do it? So you have to get in the minds of the users, and that's what researchers do. Good researchers have that empathetic side and trying to remove unbiased to try to get to the root of what the user wants. So they kind of start with that. And of course, they get into defining after that based on what the information they gathered. They ideate on potential solutions, and this may be a lot of whiteboarding, a lot of sketching. They may prototype some mock-ups and designs and clickable prototypes, and then they may go out in the field and test these design mock-ups and prototypes to try to get feedback, and then they may do it again, right? So that's human-centered design. It is its own methodology that's popular. It's been around for a little while. You can see kind of generally all these different skill sets and disciplines, kind of where they would fall. There's research under empathize, business process modeling under define, right? Journey mapping. One other thing too I didn't talk about is over in tests, like 508 compliance, and that's accessibility testing. So if we design something, we do about 50% of our work is with the government. Everything has to be 508 compliant with the government. So if we're prototyping, well, guess what? We're going to take that prototype, and when we do usability testing, we're testing it for accessibility compliance in the prototype. So when it gets developed, we're already ahead of the curve in terms of did we meet compliance early? So when they do develop, there's going to be less of an issue during testing around accessibility. So that may or may not be a factor for your organization, but it does get covered in human-centered design. Let's see. I think I'm at time here. We have a few minutes for questions. I hope that was very helpful for you. I tried to frame this in a way where you can just kind of see where does UX apply in different facets. It's not just screen design and making things look good, but where else can I apply it up front in the business case phase? How can I improve my development process? Where do those skill sets come in? If you have other questions, there's my email address. Please just email me or hit me up on LinkedIn, and happy to have a dialogue with you on that. With that, I'll turn it back over to Karen and answer any questions you have.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Really helpful. Couple questions for you. First one is simply, we had a question from the audience. Would you be willing to share your slides with today's audience?
Yes, I can. I'll make sure Karen has a copy and we can send that out.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have a question in the chat here. Could you tell us some best practices on backlinks?
Backlinks, like maybe clarification, like you mean on like a website, like a backlink pointing to a site?
Let me see. Anthony Hartley asked the question. Anthony, let's unmute you.
Oh, Karen, you dropped off.
Yes, hi, thank you. This is Anthony. Yes, that's my question related to backlinks with other, let's say with partners and others, so that there's more collaboration, and whenever somebody comes to your website, they might go to someone else that's also relevant or complementary.
Yeah, that's kind of, in my mind, that's kind of getting into the SEO a little bit, right? So trying to get backlinks to a particular application and to improve the networking between partners and clients and trying to improve your relevance and search engines. I think that's what you're asking. I think, I mean, that is its own animal. I think it kind of ties into the marketing side and SEO side. I think if you, I would just look at what is the end goal. If it is, for us, for example, on OneSpring, backlinking has been really a focus just from our website and marketing perspective to try to gain more relevance in Google, right? To try to improve, like, hey, I wrote an article on your site. Can you make sure it links back to me so we can improve relevance and that kind of stuff. So we'd kind of tie into the marketing side. And so if we had a client that wanted to focus on that, I would probably bring in more of an SEO practitioner to help clarify some of those things. So that's its kind of own role, if you will.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Sorry, Karen, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks.
There you
Okay, I see another question here. Let's say you're starting a project, and what do you need to start first? What should you go for first, the UI or UX?
Well, it depends on the type of project. If somebody, like we've had projects where clients will just say, I want it to look better. Like we actually have one right now that they said this. They don't want to change the functionality. They kind of like what they have, but it doesn't look great. That's going to be more UI focused in that case, because then I can bring a user interface designer on board. And I can say, look, here's the interfaces, come up with some comps or mock-ups of a new design. If it is a project where we want to totally reimagine it and rethink how this product works, and we want to modernize it, and we got to go do research, and we want to talk to users, I would lean on the UX side more. And we always start in that kind of case. And this is, I would say 9 times out of 10, we would start more around low fidelity design. And so low fidelity is, if you've ever seen a wireframe that doesn't have any colors to it, it just has blocks on a page, that's low fidelity. And then what happens is, as you iterate, and I showed when human-centered design, I showed ideate, as you go through this process and you iterate on the design, you go to a medium fidelity, then you go to a high fidelity. So we're big advocates of starting very low fidelity on the UI and working towards a more higher fidelity from a graphical standpoint. Because what happens is, if you start too high fidelity, you're inevitably going to have people that start critiquing the colors, the design that you put forward, and it takes the focus off of what does the user really need to do. Let's not look at the colors and all that. Let's focus on what they need to accomplish. So I would usually just generally start with UX and kind of start leaning into UI.
Great, really helpful. We have a couple more minutes if anybody has a question they want to send in. I had a question for you in the meantime, Jason. You mentioned the value gap and the importance of trying to prototype early in the life cycle, which definitely makes sense. My question was, realistically, how early in the life cycle would prototyping be feasible?
If it's a product with interfaces, I mean, it would be really early in the life cycle. Like, I mean, we've worked on projects where it's the first week we start prototyping a design. Now, we would only do that if a client said, we're not going to pay for research. That's one of the issues with the user research world, is that, especially on the commercial side, is not all clients see the value per se, and they're not willing to fund the research piece, which, let's say we're going to take a couple of weeks just to do research. If they say, we kind of know what we want and we want to start with screen designs pretty quick, then we would start prototyping week one. We would do a design thinking type workshop. We'd bring in prototyping. We do a lot of prototyping in real time. So we'll have clients in the room. And as long as we understand the scenarios, and that's where we'll start, is what are the scenarios that a user needs to accomplish? Well, they need to register. They need to be able to order a product. They need to be able to do this, 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 and we start laying out these scenarios. Then we could take a scenario and say, okay, let's start prototyping some designs and ideas around that. Again, starting with low fidelity and working towards high fidelity over time. But if we needed to jump in pretty quick, we can. We don't always recommend that now. We more recommend, let's start with some light research at least, get a good baseline of have empathy for the user and understand what their true needs are. And then we'll work into that pretty quick. But yeah, I would say you can start pretty early.
Great, I see another question here. Question says, I work with larger and small clients and I appreciate the perspective for larger clients. How would you tweak or accelerate the approach for smaller clients?
Well, this is, I mean, a lot of small clients, believe it or not, they may try to tackle this themselves. They may start trying to design something themselves just right out of the gates. And there's technology in the market that allows you to do this pretty quick. There's a tool called Sketch that we use. Adobe has Adobe XD, which allows you to prototype designs pretty quick. So if you're a smaller client and you have minimal budgets, it may be, hey, we're just going to try to do some low fidelity mockups ourselves and learn this tool, depending on how small, right, you are. If you are, this is where, to Karen's point or question, how quickly do you start prototyping designs comes into play, because if it's a small client with minimal budgets and they come to us and they say, I just need something built real quick, we may do a design thinking type session and start prototyping right out of the gates, because that's what they want, that's what they need, you know, based on their budgets. They can't spend a lot of time prototyping, so we may jump right into it, you know. So that's where you have to have some flexibility in UX. There's no, and I try to talk to my UX designers and researchers about this, is that we're not always going to have the luxury to do all the full-blown research that we want to do and should be doing, because the reality is the clients may not have the budget for that. They may not have the timetable for that. So we may need to jump into design pretty quick. So we got to put our hat on, our UX hats on, and try to design based on the knowledge we have as experts to the best of our abilities, void of potentially talking to customers directly. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Well, we're at 12:43 here. So if there are no other questions, I don't see any other ones coming in through chat, we'll plan to close out this session. Jason, thank you so much. It was really concise, clear, good, hard information. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with the group today. And thanks everybody once again for joining us. And we will circulate the slides and the recording link to all of you. So thanks once again. Thanks to
everyone. Thank you, Karen.
Yes, everybody have a great day.
You too. Take care.